Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of First and Goal. We are your hosts. I'm Big Bear T. Tyler Bansky.
I'm the curtain guy, Cole Shooty.
And everybody, we went through a lot of technical difficulties to bring this episode to you, so bear with us. I know it's not clean and shiny as we normally like it, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do to give the people what they want. And we want to give the people what they want this week. This is the game that's circled on many people's calendars in the Big Ten and our respective fan bases. Oregon and Ohio State. This is our Ducks and Bucks episode. We're going to preview this matchup upcoming and what it entails and what we think each of our opponents will bring to the table and who we ultimately think will win. So, diving into this from the get-go, talking about this matchup as a whole, I'll turn to you, Cole, first. Kind of give us a background on what we're going to have here Saturday.
I mean, what else can you say? It's a top three matchup, which we got thanks to a little bit of the chaos last week, and it's the one that we've all had circled on our calendars, especially fans of each program. We've kind of got I guess the appetizers, the hors d'oeuvres, the first 5 weeks of the season, and now we're finally to October 12th, and I think this will be a great cap off to what should be an amazing weekend of highly anticipated matchups throughout college football.
Yeah, and for many Ohio State fans, you've never had an experience at Autzen Stadium, and it is a beautiful setting and scenery and venue to play in. You certainly will not be disappointed if you're attending that game on Saturday as an opposing fan as well. Let's dive into what these teams do, what they bring to the table. We've watched every game for these two teams, and so let's turn to Ohio State first, them being the visiting team here. What did you see from Ohio State in those first 5 games, Cole? And I guess strengths and weaknesses of the Buckeyes.
Yeah, I have been pleasantly surprised, and that was already with the assumption that it was going to improve vastly with the running game. I mean, you're talking about an offense overall that ranks fourth in scoring at 46 points a game, 23rd in passing, 15th in rushing, and a total offense of nine. And I really don't feel like they've done anything outside of changing their tendencies and how they run some of these plays. And what I mean by that is kind of the Chip Kelly effect, which is something that Oregon fans, especially you, are very familiar with. It's a lot of misdirection. We've seen a lot more counter plays, a little more inside zone. It's not just that stretch zone to the boundary that Ryan Day just kept beating to death and putting the offensive line in a really bad position for the last 3 years. It felt like, and on top of that, there's now constraints because we're actually running the quarterback. So I think you're seeing the full capability of the rushing offense now that you have a running quarterback. Now that you are putting offensive linemen in advantageous positions, and then on the cherry on top of this rushing Sunday, I guess, is you get to run it with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. So that's really what stood out with me. I think we all knew the passing attack was going to be something spectacular. We've talked about Emeka Egbuka. We've talked about Carnell Tate. J.J. Smith is what everybody thought he was. Him and Ryan Williams are apparently just aliens, come down to visit us for a few years before they go on to the NFL. Um, so it's the offense is clicking. The defense really just, you can tell it's filled with a bunch of dudes who have played a lot of college football. They understand what their assignments are. I don't think Jim Knowles has done anything too exotic to this point, because these guys are able to just do their jobs and kind of lean on other teams. So I think a lot of that, it leads me to saying that you're going to see a lot of the offense and the defense digging a little bit deeper into their bags this weekend, and I expect that to be the same to be true of Oregon, and what they'll do this weekend as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that wonder if Oregon's been vanilla in the last couple weeks of how they've led up to this game, and maybe to some extent, but I never really buy into that wholeheartedly. The fact that to come into a matchup like this one with Ohio State and to just open your playbook for the first time seems like a devil's errand because you're just inviting mistakes to happen. And do you want that to happen in the most crucial games of the year? I don't think so. Given an overview on Oregon, yeah, the first couple games haven't been pretty. What we know about this team is what we've talked about in the preseason is they are a highly talented bunch. I think on the offensive side, they're not polished. And we saw that in the first couple games. They gave up more sacks on Dylan Gabriel than they gave up to on Bo Nix all of the last season, the last two seasons even. The offensive line has started to play better. They've shifted the personnel around, put them back in a solid position with Pancho Laulu in the middle, and they're humming. They didn't allow any pressures last week, according to statistics, against Michigan State. Granted, Dylan Gabriel was running around a little bit there, but I think where want them to be better on that offensive front is I want them to be able to run the ball better. I feel like they haven't been able to have a consistent rushing offense. They have the backs there with Noah Whittington and Jordan James. We saw it against Michigan State. Jordan James had a breakout game, but that hasn't held true with a lower level competition. I put in quotes because of what Boise State's done so far, and even Idaho for what they've put up so far. Defensively, though, I couldn't have asked for more from at least the front seven. I think Oregon's defensive line has been fantastic. You got guys like Derek Harmon, who transferred in from Michigan State, has 5+ sacks and tackles for loss. You have Mateo Uiagalelei, who's starting to take that next level of development and get into backfield. Jordan Birch is actually alive in the backfield this year. So I think they're doing their job. I think the linebackers are playing solid with Jeffrey Bassa. They're running like a four-man rotation there. Secondary, I don't want to give them a whole ton of praise because I know there's still room for improvement. There's a lot of veterans in that backfield for the Oregon defense. You got guys like Kobe Savage, Jabbar Muhammad, Brandon Johnson has been fantastic. Dante Manning, who was an Under Armour All-American. There's pieces all over the board as we've talked and you've talked about too with Ohio State. There's talent galore for these two teams. And it's going to be very interesting in terms of now they face off and how do they come into this game, right? How are they prepared? What do they run? And how do they react as the game goes on? And kind of taking us into the next part of the conversation really is what do you see as being a key for Ohio State going into this game? What do you think they're going to focus on going against an Oregon defense or even the Oregon offense?
I think they're going to try and establish the run. I think that's the biggest thing that they want to do because it's what they've done the first 5 games. I think that you and I both know, having watched a lot of college football and football in general, that if you can run the ball very well, you can assume control of the clock and you can kind of assume control of the tempo of the game as well. And so they know that Oregon wants to go quickly, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as well, because that's how Oregon gets in rhythm. It's not Chip Kelly fast, but they still have quite a bit of up tempo to them, and that's going to play into taking away from Ohio State's talented defensive line front. But I think they know that tempo is what Oregon wants to do, so they're going to try and counteract that by running the ball, and kind of controlling that clock and taking that time and momentum away from the home team and the home crowd as well. On defense, I truly believe that we won't be as super aggressive, I think, as some Buckeye fans maybe want Jim Knowles to be. I know he's earned this moniker as a mad scientist, and he draws up plays and fronts that shouldn't make sense and shouldn't work. But when you have a guy like Dylan Gabriel who's adept at escaping the pocket and making plays on the run, I think it's going to be very focused on cage rushing, making sure that he doesn't get away from them or get to the outside and get passes to Tez Johnson and let him get in space. because as good as our secondary is, Oregon does have the threats to challenge them downfield, and so I think that is their main goal. Is they know they're not going to stop Oregon, but they're going to do what they can fundamentally and plan design wise to at least slow them down and control the game, especially in a hostile environment.
Yeah, with Jim Knowles, that point you had there, I was listening to interviews today even, and Jabbar Muhammad, who had time at Oklahoma State when Jim Knowles was his DC there. He's familiar with him. He knows that the question was asked what he thought and if he knows how Jim Knowles is running defense. He flat out said he's like, no, he's changed things, but he said it hasn't looked as aggressive as it has before, and that plays to like your point there. If you come super aggressive, you can leak out somewhere, right? There could be a weakness in that element. For Oregon's offense, I think what has been a lingering concern is the consistency of Dylan Gabriel, especially in the red area. That's kind of the point that everybody circles on their key points is that he has had trouble in the key area. Oregon as a whole, really, if you looked at games against like Michigan State last week, when they were inside the 20 or between the 20s, they ran the ball fine, they threw the ball fine, they moved it with ease. But when they got inside the red zone, they either got stuffed up at the line of scrimmage a little more often, or Gabriel was under a little more pressure and he wasn't making not precise throws, but his reads were late. You could see a wide receiver starting to make a cut and get open, and then that extra second it takes him to get the ball out and doesn't get it out quick enough, it can lead to an interception. It leads to, again, taking points off the board. So for Oregon's offense, that's so key because in a game with Ohio State where you know that their offense is going to put up points, if you don't put points up in return and you leave points off the board, that's where it's going to cost you. And with a team like Ohio State, if you have too many of those mistakes, it can cost you big time. It could be, the game getting out of hand kind of big. So I think Oregon's going to stress on that, trying to think through progressions, get the ball out, play clean. Back to running the ball, I think that Oregon's offensive line is going to come into this with a little bit of a motivating factor. Like they've been talking about, yeah, 2021 they were kind of showing that they weren't the small Oregons of 2014 and before. They're playing bigger boy football now. And I think what they're going to come into on Saturday is they want to be able to establish the run because without it, they're not going to be able to get Gabriel to throw the ball the way they need to. So expect Jordan James to get the ball, even if it takes 4 downs to do it. Dan Lanning's been aggressive sometimes on 4th down. Defensively, same thing with running the ball. Oregon has done a decent job with getting into the backfield. I like to key on Ashton Genty because everyone is hyped up how well he's played this year for Boise State. He did gash Oregon for almost 200 yards rushing, but I always key out that outside of 3 explosive run plays, he really only averaged like 2 to 3 yards a carry. So that's where I say Oregon is not polished. If they're not gap sound, if they're not sticking to their scheme, that's where they get beat. And that's where you're saying right there, Judkins and Travion Henderson will exploit that. And so that's a key for that Oregon defense for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that was the thing that kind of stuck out to me watching Oregon, at least the highlights through the last couple of games, and especially that Boise State game is um, that defensive line is supremely talented. And you mentioned a couple of names, but there are a lot of guys that they will take their chances and they'll go rogue and they'll try to make a play. And I think a lot of those times, and especially those runs you saw from Genty, that was those times where instead of keeping their leverage, pushing it back towards the middle, towards the linebackers, they try to shoot a gap inside and somebody gets out. And then all of a sudden, he's going down the sidelines for a 45-yard touchdown. So I agree with you wholeheartedly there that if Oregon wants to contain this running game, they got to do the boring stuff, right? They got to be gap sound. They got to make the tackles. and they have to force the ball into their playmakers and not think that they have to do it single handedly.
Looking at Ohio State's offense, and here's what I notice and kind of have looked at through game film highlights is there hasn't been a lot of design QB runs so far for Will Howard. Question one, do you expect them to put that wrinkle into the offensive game plan this weekend? And the other thing is Will Howard has done exceptionally well when he's not pressured. If let's say Derek Harmon or Jordan Birch are able to get off the edge and get towards the backfield and put pressure and even hurry Will Howard, is that a weakness for Ohio State, do you think? Well, how do you think that they'll combat those types of situations?
Um, Both great questions. I think the first part of it is yes. I think they're going to absolutely use the QB run more than they have the entire year, and I think you saw the appetizer to it in the Iowa game, right? That was the most that I think I've ever seen them use what was very clearly a directly designed QB run multiple times throughout that game. We've seen it a couple of times more towards goal line situations, which was nice because there were so many times last year that we got stuffed because we just didn't utilize it at all, and we were running into 10-man fronts basically. So yeah, I do think you'll see it quite a bit. And to the second point of your question, yeah, I think he does have a tendency to get a bit skittish in terms of when he's pressured. I think there's a lot of times. I'm going to say this: he's extremely adept at moving around the pocket, and definitely is better in that area than what Kyle McCord was. But sometimes he has a tendency to lock in on targets, and then when he is pressured, he feels like the ball has to come out immediately. And while I appreciate not wanting to take a sack, sometimes that might be a better scenario than turning the ball over entirely. Um, and I guess I'd like to ask you the same question because it's something that we've talked about with Gabriel as well. Is he seems to lock in on targets and almost waits too long to let the ball go. And so I'm going to get your thoughts on that. But I think, truthfully, you and I have talked about this. I think both quarterbacks are going to end up throwing an interception on Saturday. I think that is very likely. So if you're a gambling person, I think if you want to put money down on both of those guys throwing an interception, I think that is very likely on Saturday just because of how good and rangy and athletic these defenses are and the small amount of shortcomings that both of these quarterbacks have.
It is a fair point, and I agree with you when we were talking about Gabriel is it does look like he's locking in on targets. I feel like he has been favoring guys like Tez Johnson more often than not in the grand scheme of it all. I mean, I'm looking at the receiving stats so far this year, and um, Terrence Ferguson has 16 receptions, Evan Stewart has 16, Trayshawn Holden has 19, and um, I'm surprised that I don't see Tez Johnson on this list. Otherwise, I'm blind. Oh, Tez Johnson has 43. Talk about locking in a little more often than the other. Now, granted, Tez Johnson has a lot of elusiveness. He can be a game wrecker with how he moves his feet, but you have to get the others more involved, I think, because you're going to have Ohio State's best on Tez Johnson. And the wrinkle that I like for Oregon to be able to use more often is Terrence Ferguson. He's still yet to score a touchdown this year. He had one slip through his fingers last week. I know he's due, and he's 6'5", 255, if I'm not mistaken. He's borderline comparable to Travis Kelce. He moves his feet well. He gets upfield with decent acceleration. That's a big dude carrying the ball. And there was one play that I almost had to chuckle to myself last week watching the Michigan State game because there were like two Spartans trying to bring him down and they were like dragging behind. So I was like, oh wow, like that's a major threat to have in the tight end position. Not a lot of teams have that kind of tight end threat. But with holding the ball too long, is he under pressure? Not all the time. but in the red area, it's you got to get the ball out quicker. And he's acknowledged that in press conferences that he was taking too long. So I hope that's being addressed. I hope that's something that they're working on more. But again, you're a 6-year quarterback. If you haven't figured that out by now, like that's a toughie. Um, the other benefit of the doubt I'm going to give to Dylan Gabriel is like big games. I think last year, the Oklahoma Texas game, it was his best game all year. Hopefully, it comes out in that kind of style, but it's yet to be seen. I'm not so certain. So fingers crossed on that part. If there was an X factor that you had to circle for Ohio State's defense, who would you say that is?
I think it's going to be Caleb Downs. I think they have fully unleashed him, which is a funny thing to say because of how proficient he was as a freshman and just how talented he is overall. But I think they kind of were limiting what they were asking of him the first couple of games, and now you're seeing what it looks like when he's allowed to do what he does best, which is use his athleticism and ranginess and come down into the box and make tackles and um, cover tight ends and like the guys you mentioned. I think that's going to be huge. I think if Jordan James is going to be able to break it to the outside, and if Caleb is able to come down and make a few tackles that could potentially save you know 20 plus yard runs, that's going to make a big difference coming down the stretch. And you mentioned the tight end, and we'll talk about it later, but I think that's a huge point for Oregon because I think that's a very uh, weak spot for the Buckeyes. The linebacker play has been good. I would qualify it as good, probably a B minus overall, but uh, they do not give me any type of warm or fuzzy feelings when it comes to cover tight ends, and I think that's something that Oregon could exploit quite heavily. But I think that is something that Downs coming down, from the strong safety spot could help out with immensely. So um, I guess I'll ask you the same thing for Oregon's defense, knowing all of the weapons that Ohio State has, knowing how much they spread the ball out. Who's the guy that can kind of help mitigate some of that and help slow down this explosive offense?
Well, since we're keying in on the run game, and I've talked about Oregon's defensive line enough, I'll give them a break. Um, there's a lot of pieces in the secondary, but I'm not quite sure I want to pick one of those guys quite yet. I think it starts with Jeffrey Bassa at linebacker. He's the field general of that defense. He's their energizer bunny. He should be finally healthy at this point. He's got to be everywhere. I mean, when they use him in blitz packages, he needs to be creating havoc for Will Howard so that that ball doesn't come out clean or he's rushed to make a decision that he's not too fond with. In the running game, he has to be that guy to put a stop to Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson because if they get past him, they're more than likely going to get 20 yards a carry. I mean that's just how they run the ball, and we've seen them in other games. So the linebacker position is such a key point that I'm emphasizing in this type of matchup because they have such a role in all facets of the offensive play. Whether they're passing the ball or running the ball, they're going to be involved. So I need him to be an absolute game wrecker. So I would have to say that I would go with Jeffrey Bassa um, to have to stand out on Saturday for sure. So let's get into the game itself. We've talked about the teams. Let's talk about the game. Um, Path to victory. And when we talk about previewing and making our picks, it'd be silly for us to pick our own teams because what's the fun in that? So I'm going to give you the job of Oregon and you give me the job of Ohio State. Let's talk about Oregon's path to victory. What do you see Oregon having to do to win a signature game against Ohio State Saturday?
Yeah, I thought this would be an interesting way to approach it because last time we did this back in 2021, I actually really liked your approach where you said, this is what Oregon has to do. You weren't necessarily picking the Ducks outright. And I think it saves our listeners from having to listen to us drone on and on about our, our homerisms and obviously who we'll be rooting for on Saturday. But for Oregon to win, I think on offense, I think that rhythm has to be there. Like I said, we talked about Oregon wants to get the ball out under 3 seconds. And I think that's a great way to mitigate what Ohio State's defensive line wants to do. I think it's a great way to get out on the perimeter. And even though Ohio State's defense is built to defend horizontally, I think Oregon has the athletes to challenge them in space and make them make tackles in space. And when you can do that, when you can get those one-on-one matchups, athletes on athletes, all you got to do is win a couple of them, right? And you can break some really big plays and put yourself in scoring position. Um, on the, I guess, well, give me a second before I flip over to the defense. So rhythm, I think Gabriel has to be effective with his legs. I think if his first couple of reads aren't there, I think he needs to just go pick up the yards, keep the offense on schedule, and again, allow that offense to operate in that rhythm. That rhythm is destroyed. You could have two great plays where, all of a sudden you pick up 8 yards, 7 yards, and then on the ensuing first down, you get sacked for 10. Now you're completely off schedule. You're completely out of rhythm. That can kill an entire drive. So I think he needs to understand that there's no need to force plays against this defense. Not every single, play is going to be a winning one. So pick up the yards that they're there, keep you guys on schedule, keep it going along. Um, I think the tight end is going to play a big factor into that. I think that he can be used not only as an outlet for Gabriel, but also to challenge the linebackers and especially challenge their ability to cover in space. Because I think there's a lot of yards to be had there, and I think that will greatly help Oregon in the red zone, who they're not the greatest so far throughout the season. They're ranked 92nd, 21 trips, 7 rushing touchdowns, 7 passing touchdowns, 3 field goals, 81%. They're not terrible when they get in the red zone, right? But you're now going against one of the best red zone defenses in the country, right? Ohio State's ranked number 3. They've only allowed 5 trips, 1 rushing touchdown, 2 passing touchdowns, no field goals. Okay. So when you get in the red zone, you have to be able to utilize those pieces with that shrunken field to not only, score, but score touchdowns. And I think Ferguson could be a huge part of that. And I think that will be what they try to utilize, not only across the field, but in the red zone, especially. On defense, I think Oregon is going to be aggressive because they want to challenge Will Howard passing. And I think they should. I think he has shown that he can make mistakes. He will make mistakes. And I think that's where you want to attack Ohio State. It's kind of a dual-edged sword where I don't think Oregon is going to commit 9 guys to the box because they know how good Ohio State is out wide. But they know that they have the athletes on the outside, like Jabbar Muhammad, to cover well enough that they can send corner blitzes, they can send twists and stunts and put pressure in Will's face and make him beat them basically over the top. And then their red zone defense has to be stifling as well. Again, this is a little bit of a struggle for the Ducks. 104 in the country. They've allowed 12 trips, 6 rushing touchdowns, 1 passing touchdowns, 4 field goals. Okay. They're going against the number 1 red zone offense in the country. So the Buckeyes, more likely than not, will get into the red zone. Oregon has to find a way to get those key stops or at least force Ohio State into field goals. And I think if they can do a good majority of those, I think they will find themselves in really good position to win at the end of the day.
No arguments here. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, and so I'll flip it to paths to victory. I think for Ohio State here in this one, offensively for Ohio State, I think it starts with the offensive line. In the preseason, there were a lot of people kind of questioning how good this offensive line was going to be. Maybe we, you know, some people still say we haven't seen an opponent to test them yet. This is where Ohio State's offensive line needs to put it to bed. They need to control that line of scrimmage with Oregon's defensive front because if you can hold off guys like Derek Harmon, Jordan Birch, Mateo Uyunglele from being able to get in your backfield and take yards away from you, you can essentially open up your offense to a lot of different possibilities. Now, Chip Kelly being a former Duck coach, one thing I know about him is there's always something in his game plan. It's not out of pettiness, but he has a creative niche, I like to say. So, what sticks out in my mind is Oregon loved running counters against Ohio State in 2021. If they can find a way to start having success running the ball and do it consistently, I would not be surprised if Chip Kelly starts to run a ton of counter plays on Oregon's defense, just as a little assertive physicality there. Because again, if you can establish that run game and run it with ease, you open up your pass game. You can get guys like Emeka Buka, Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith involved, maybe even G. Scott if you can, fit some play schemes and therefore that tight end to get involved too. That's huge. Um, and the other thing that I'll key in on for the offense is the offense's ability to consistently put up points, whether you're in the red area, whether you can get explosive plays on the Oregon defense. That's a key piece because in many games so far this year, as a Duck fan watching, I've felt that we've had to lean on our defense as a crutch at times when the offense is not consistent. And the defense has played extremely well, being able to keep that offense in the game, but also on track. So if you can bend that defense enough to keep putting points up, you might get enough chances to pull away. Now, on the defensive side of the ball, you have to get to Dylan Gabriel. You have to be able to put hats on him and get pressure, force him into those uncomfortable throws, whether it's an out route or to the corner where he, again, as we've talked about earlier, gets the ball out late and a safety or a corner comes over the top and takes it right out of their hands. There's a possession. Running the ball. If Oregon can't run the ball for more than 2 to 3 yards a carry, that's not first down material. Forcing them into three and outs, punting the ball, the defense doing their job, getting the ball back to the offense, taking possessions away from the Ducks is important for Ohio State in order to continue that path to victory. So it's less about playing clean for Ohio State. It's more about the physicality and then consistency, especially on the offensive side of the ball for me, for sure. Any questions I didn't cover, Cole? I mean, bring them up and we can debate them. I know we're, you know, not short on time, but
No, I listen. We you and I could talk about this forever and ever, and I think people are already probably tired of us talking about this. You can. This is one of those games, and we do it every year with these top five, top three matchups where we go back and forth, and this is what matters. No, this is what matters. It's eventually you got to put the ball on the turf and go at it, right? So that's where I'm going to leave it at. Is we've talked pretty much ad nauseum about anything you could in this matchup and what we think is going to play a factor. But at the end of the day, these guys got to line it up, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may.
nope, I agree. So we've talked about our respective opponents. Let's talk about our respective teams real quick. And let's give the fans our prediction. We'll circle back, we'll eat crow, however it falls. Um, how do you see this playing out from the Ohio State side of things, as a final score analysis?
I've seen a lot of predictions over the last couple of weeks, some that make a lot of sense, some that are pretty out there, if we're being wild. The one guy who thought that Texas wasn't going to score 10 points on Michigan apparently thinks that Oregon is going to win by 28 points. And I got to wonder if these people are just doing it for clicks or what. But listen, I think this is going to be very close. You and I have talked again plenty of times about these games. We call them sledgehammer games, right? It's just two top-notch opponents, two top-notch programs, and I think the veteran aspect of Ohio State is what ultimately will help them kind of come out on top here. I think talent and athletes, it's pretty much spread equal across both teams. I don't think you can really point in one direction or the other and say, "Oh, that's a clear advantage for that team." But I think the fact that Ohio State has so many guys that have played college football for so long, have been a part of so many games like this, that ultimately that will help them come out on top. And I think it's going to be a little bit higher scoring than maybe some other people think. I think both offenses are going to get into rhythm kind of through the second quarter on. And I have it as a 34-31 game in favor of the Buckeyes.
And that's fair. I tried to even play it on NCAA college football myself. I was originally I made a bet at the beginning of the season that it would take the under, and even trying to play it last night myself with a 10-10 score going in at halftime, it still ended up being in the 30s for both teams at the end. And that's why I think the second half is like where this thing blows up, right? These teams are going to hit their best. Um, an argument for Oregon. I think that on our side of the ball, we've had a lot of players with a lot of bad taste in their mouth from last year. You lose to Washington in two huge games. You think back a couple of years ago, you lose to Utah in your biggest games of the season. These guys have had so many punches in the mouth that you get a big game at home. Dan Lanning searching for that first ever signature win. Granted, whatever you see on social media that they say he needs, other than a national championship, like this is the one that has to happen. And I think the players are going to respond really well. I think they're going to get up for this. I think you're going to see these guys at their best. And if they're not, that's going to be the make or break moment. Not going to circle on anybody or throw any names out there, but there's a couple players I circle on and say, if you do not give your best, we will lose. So in a hopeful manner, because I can never, get too hell bent on this. It's a field goal game. I don't even care what the score ends up as. I think if Oregon wins, it's by a field goal. There's no blowout here. If there's a blowout on either side of the ball, you'll find me drinking my sorrows and whiskey by midnight Eastern, and we'll just go about our day on Sunday and maybe find me a church. I don't know. So that's Ducks and Bucks, people. We are beyond excited for this. We've been waiting for this. It's here. This might be the first of many times we meet this season. Fingers crossed. And yeah, let's strap them up and let's go. So everybody, appreciate you joining us on our special Ducks and Bucks episode. Watch college football this weekend. We'll put out a graphic for Goal Line Stand. And as always, this has been First and Goal.